Listen carefully, because what transpired on Friday, January 16th, 2026, could represent the single most pivotal trade development in North American history since NAFTA was inked 3 decades ago. And here's what makes this moment so profoundly significant. It's not about statements delivered at podiums or frantic social media posts at dawn. It's about documents signed in Beijing while Washington observed from the sidelines. And the tremors, the shock waves cascading through every executive suite from Detroit to Mexico City to the grain terminals of Saskatchewan, are only just beginning to be felt. I'm Dav, and this is Hems Reports. I need you to grasp something fundamental before we proceed any further. For the past 3/4 of a century, North American commerce has operated on a single unshakable premise. Canada follows America's lead, not because Ottawa lacks independence, not because Canadians don't pursue their own national interests, but because the economic integration between these two nations runs so deep, so complex, so thoroughly interwoven into the fabric of both economies that divergence seemed functionally impossible. 2,500 miles of undefended frontier, $1.3 trillion in annual bilateral commerce, supply chains that traverse the 49th parallel, 7, 8, sometimes 10 times before a single finished product reaches a consumer. That's not merely trade policy, that's economic DNA. And on Friday, in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney took a sledgehammer to that DNA. The scene in Beijing, when nobody expected headlines. Let me set the scene for you. It's early morning in Washington, still dark outside when reports begin filtering through diplomatic channels. Canadian Prime Minister meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. First official visit by a Canadian leader to Beijing in 8 years. The diplomatic deep freeze that commenced when Canada arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou back in 2018, when China retaliated by detaining 2 Canadian citizens, when relations deteriorated so catastrophically that trade became weaponized and trust evaporated completely. All of that bitter history hanging in the room like smoke. Nobody anticipated a breakthrough. Nobody expected significant announcements. What everyone anticipated was symbolic gestures, vague commitments, the customary diplomatic theater that generates nothing but photo opportunities. What they received instead was a comprehensive trade agreement that fundamentally reorients Canada's economic trajectory. And here's where this becomes fascinating. Here's where the agricultural dimension becomes absolutely essential to comprehending what just occurred. Now, the user who requested this script mentioned wheat. And I need to clarify something important here. The primary agricultural commodity at the center of this agreement isn't wheat, it's canola. But that distinction matters less than you might assume, because what we're genuinely discussing here is Canada's entire agricultural export architecture, and wheat is absolutely part of that broader landscape. Canadian farmers ship more than 8 million tons of grain to the United States annually, worth nearly 9.5 billion Canadian dollars. Wheat, canola, barley, pulses, all of it flowing southward across the border in a supply chain so efficient, so reliable, that most Americans never even contemplate where their flour originates or which fields produce the grain in their breakfast cereal. But here's what unfolded over the past year that insufficient people were monitoring closely enough. China, Canada's second-largest agricultural market, imposed devastating tariffs on Canadian canola. We're discussing tariffs that reached 84%. 84%. For perspective, that doesn't merely make Canadian canola less competitive in Chinese markets. It makes exporting it economically impossible. 40,000 Canadian canola farmers, thousands of workers in processing facilities, entire rural communities in Saskatchewan and Alberta that depend on agricultural exports. They got severed overnight. Their second biggest customer simply vanished. And where was the support? Where was the trade assistance? Where was the diplomatic intervention that might have eased those tariffs and restored market access? Washington was too preoccupied imposing its own tariffs. Trump's trade war leaves Canada stranded. Trump's administration in its second iteration has been even more aggressive than the first iteration. Steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, threats to abandon the USMCA entirely. And when Carney traveled to Washington seeking relief, seeking some acknowledgement that Canada is America's largest trading partner, and perhaps, just perhaps, deserves to be treated differently than China or the European Union, what did he receive? Nothing. Worse than nothing, he received Trump publicly calling for Canada to become the 51st state. He received public humiliation masquerading as negotiating strategy. So Carney did what any rational leader would do when their primary market becomes unpredictable and their secondary market slams the door shut. He went searching for alternatives, and he found China. The deal that changed everything. Here's what the agreement entails. And pay close attention, because the specifics matter enormously. Canada agrees to slash its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to just 6.1%. That's a massive reduction. In exchange, China commits to cutting tariffs on Canadian canola seed to approximately 15% by March 1st, down from 84%. That's the kind of tariff reduction that doesn't just restore trade, it supercharges it. Canadian canola farmers went from being completely excluded from the Chinese market to having preferential access. Billions of dollars in exports suddenly viable again. Rural communities that were staring at bankruptcy suddenly have a lifeline. But the EV component, that's where this becomes geopolitically explosive. Under the agreement, China can export up to 49,000 electric vehicles annually into Canada at the reduced tariff rate. And before you dismiss that as a modest figure, consider this. That quota nearly matches pre-tariff import levels. Carney isn't cracking the door open for Chinese EVs. He's swinging it wide. And he's executing this precisely at the moment when the United States has imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, specifically to exclude them from the North American market. Trump's measured response. For about 5 minutes. Trump's response to all this? Publicly. Surprisingly measured. When asked about the deal on Friday, Trump told reporters, that's what he should be doing. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that. Almost supportive, almost understanding. But that public facade lasted approximately as long as it took for his cabinet members to start talking. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer warned that Canada would regret the decision. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said bringing Chinese cars into the Canadian market was a mistake. The message was unmistakable. Trump himself might be willing to shrug this off publicly, but his administration perceives this as a direct threat to American interests. And they're not incorrect. Why this matters? The USMCA review is just 6 months away. Here's why this matters so profoundly for supply chains, not just in automotive, not just in agriculture, but across every sector of the North American economy. The USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA back in 2020, comes up for mandatory review on July 1st, 2026. That's less than 6 months from now. And Trump has already declared the agreement irrelevant. He's floated the concept of walking away entirely, of negotiating separate bilateral deals with Mexico and Canada, of fundamentally restructuring North American trade relationships. That uncertainty alone is causing companies to postpone investments, to defer expansion plans, to accumulate inventory buffers in case the entire system collapses. Now, inject Carney's China deal into that equation. The automotive industry is particularly vulnerable because vehicle manufacturing in North America isn't contained within any single country. A car assembled in Michigan might have an engine built in Ontario, a transmission from Mexico, electronics from Texas, and interior components from Quebec. Parts cross borders multiple times during production. The entire system is constructed on the assumption of frictionless movement. No tariffs, no delays, no surprises. Chinese EVs entering Canada through this new agreement represent a wild card that nobody in Detroit or Washington knows how to calculate. Will those vehicles remain in Canada? Will they leak across the border into the U.S. market despite tariffs? Will Chinese manufacturers use Canada as a backdoor to establish North American assembly operations? And most critically, if Trump decides to retaliate by imposing new tariffs on Canadian automotive exports, does the entire integrated supply chain that produces millions of vehicles annually just cease functioning? The human cost: jobs, communities, infrastructure. The automotive sector alone represents $300 billion in annual trade between Canada and the United States. 300,000 jobs in Canada are directly tied to auto manufacturing. Another million jobs are indirectly connected through parts suppliers, logistics, dealerships, maintenance. When trade experts discuss supply chain paralysis, this is what they mean. It's not that trucks stop rolling or factories shut down overnight. It's that the uncertainty itself, the not knowing whether the rules governing yesterday's shipment will still apply to tomorrow's, that uncertainty freezes decision-making. Companies can't plan. They can't invest. They can't commit to long-term contracts when the entire regulatory framework might change in 6 months. And agriculture faces the identical crisis. Canadian grain farmers export to the United States because the supply chain makes it logical. Storage facilities on both sides of the border. Rail networks that move seamlessly across provinces and states. Processing facilities that can handle Canadian wheat alongside American crops without batting an eye. Bread baked in New York might contain flour milled in Buffalo from wheat grown in Manitoba that was stored in a Saskatchewan elevator before being shipped on Canadian Pacific Railway cars through Montana. That's not trade in the abstract. That's physical infrastructure constructed over decades, optimized for efficiency. What happens if Trump decides Carney's China deal represents a betrayal and slaps retaliatory tariffs on Canadian agricultural imports? What happens to those grain elevators, those rail cars, those processing facilities that were built assuming open borders and predictable trade? They don't just become less efficient. They become stranded assets. Billions of dollars in infrastructure suddenly worthless because the economic assumptions that justified their construction no longer hold. Carney had no choice. Survival, not ideology. And here's the element nobody in Washington seems to fully comprehend. Carney didn't make this decision because he wanted to pivot toward China. He made it because Trump left him no alternative. When you're the leader of a country that sends 75% of its exports to a single market, and that market becomes unpredictable, hostile, led by someone who perceives trade as a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other loses, you have to find alternatives. It's not ideology, it's survival. Canadian canola farmers needed markets. They needed buyers. They needed someone, anyone, willing to purchase their product at prices that wouldn't bankrupt entire communities. Trump wasn't offering that. His administration was too busy imposing tariffs, too focused on domestic politics, too convinced that economic pressure would force Canada into submission. So Carney went to Beijing. And Xi Jinping, who has been observing American trade policy alienate partner after partner, saw an opportunity. This is exactly what China has been attempting to accomplish for years. China's long game isn't really about defeating the United States militarily, or even out-innovating Silicon Valley, though honestly they're working pretty hard on both fronts. The real strategy is to fracture American alliances, to drive wedges between Washington and its traditional partners, and to create a world where countries feel like they have to choose between the American orbit and the Chinese sphere of influence. And, well, Trump, with his tariffs and threats and his complete disregard for the value of stable, predictable trade relationships, is basically handing China those opportunities on a silver platter. Edward Alden at the Council on Foreign Relations called Carney's move a huge declaration of realignment in Canada's economic relations. And you know what? He's right. But it's actually bigger than that. It's a signal to every American ally that the old assumptions just don't hold anymore. The assumption that America will support its friends, the assumption that economic integration with the United States brings security and stability, The assumption that Washington will act in ways that consider the interests of its partners and not just its own narrow political calculations, all of that is falling apart. Not because Carney wants it to happen, but because Trump's policies are making it impossible to maintain. And the supply chain implications just ripple out from there. The European Union is moving ahead with a trade pact with Mercosur, the South American alliance that includes Brazil and Argentina. India is actively negotiating with multiple partners to diversify away from American markets. Mexico, which actually surpassed Canada as America's top trading partner in recent years, is watching all of this really closely, running its own calculations about whether sticking with Washington still makes economic sense. You can start to see the pattern. Trump's trade war, which he frames as a way to bring jobs back to America and revitalize domestic manufacturing, is actually pushing America's trading partners right into the arms of competitors. And once those new trade relationships are set, once Canadian farmers are selling to China instead of America, once European companies are sourcing from South America instead of North America, once those supply chains are reconfigured, they don't just snap back into place when the political winds shift. Infrastructure gets built, relationships get established, contracts get signed, and suddenly the American market just isn't as dominant as it used to be. So let's talk about what happens next, because the timeline here is really compressed, and honestly, the stakes couldn't be higher. The USMCA review starts in July. That's 6 months. In the world of trade policy, that's not just fast. It's breakneck speed. Normal trade negotiations usually take years. The original USMCA negotiation took 2 years of intense back and forth, and that was when all the parties basically agreed they wanted a deal. This time, Trump has already called the agreement irrelevant. Carney has just shown that Canada is willing to look elsewhere. Mexico is caught in the middle, trying to maintain relationships with both northern neighbors while dealing with its own domestic pressures. So, what could the review produce? Best case scenario, all 3 countries agree to extend the agreement for another 16 years with minimal changes. Trade continues, supply chains stay intact. Businesses can plan with confidence. But that would require Trump to back off his maximalist rhetoric, Carney to feel like Canada got a fair deal, and Mexico to somehow thread the needle between American demands and its own interests. Given what we've seen over the past year, that outcome seems, well, unlikely. A more realistic scenario? Negotiations drag on for months, maybe even years. The agreement keeps going in 1-year increments while talks continue, creating exactly the kind of uncertainty that just paralyzes investment. Companies can't make long-term plans when they don't know what the trade rules will look like next year. So they hold on to cash, they delay expansions, they hedge their bets, and the economy slows down. Worst-case scenario, Trump pulls out, the agreement collapses. We go back to pre-NAFTA trade relationships, which means tariffs come back across the board. Not just the targeted tariffs we're seeing now, comprehensive duties on pretty much everything. The automotive industry, which has built its entire North American operation around integrated supply chains, would face catastrophic disruption. Agriculture would see market access disappear overnight. Manufacturing would scramble to reconfigure production networks that took decades to optimize. It would be, without exaggeration, the most significant blow to the North American economy since the Great Depression. And here's the cruel irony. Trump thinks he's playing hardball. He thinks tariffs and threats and economic nationalism are making America stronger. But what he's actually doing is weakening the alliances that made American economic dominance possible in the first place. The post-World War II order, the system of treaties, trade agreements, and mutual commitments that allowed American companies to build global supply chains and American workers to access products from all over the world at reasonable prices. That entire system depended on trust. It depended on the belief that America would act predictably, would honor its commitments, would consider the interests of its partners. Trump is burning that trust to the ground. And Carney's China deal is just the latest sign that this incineration is speeding up. When America's closest ally, the country that shares a 2,500-mile undefended border, decides that Beijing is a more reliable partner than Washington, something fundamental has fractured. But let's bring this back to the specific paralysis this creates. When we discuss supply chains being paralyzed, what does that actually mean for regular people? Because this isn't just abstract economic theory. This affects prices at the grocery store. It affects whether your car gets repaired on time. It affects whether the manufacturer in your town stays open or closes and relocates operations overseas. It affects whether the farmer down the road can sell this year's harvest or has to plow it under because there's no buyer. Canadian wheat and grain exports to the United States, those 8 million tons I mentioned earlier, they don't simply disappear if tariffs get imposed or if relationships deteriorate. The wheat still exists. The farmers still need to sell it, but suddenly they're searching for new buyers, new supply chains, new logistics networks. And while they're searching, prices spike on the American side because domestic production can't immediately replace Canadian imports. Bread becomes more expensive. Cereal prices climb. Bakeries face higher costs and either raise prices or reduce staff. The identical dynamic plays out in automotive. If Canadian auto parts suddenly face tariffs, American assembly plants either pay more or find new suppliers. But you don't just snap your fingers and replace suppliers that have been integrated into your production system for decades. New suppliers need to be vetted, qualified, tested. Their components need to meet specifications. Their delivery schedules need to synchronize with production timelines. All of that consumes months, perhaps even years. Meanwhile, production slows, models get delayed, prices increase, workers get furloughed. This is what supply chain paralysis looks like. It's not a single catastrophic event. It's 1,000 small disruptions, each one individually manageable, but collectively overwhelming. It's death by 1,000 cuts that happens when the predictable becomes unpredictable, when the reliable becomes questionable, when the partners you counted on start making alternative plans. And Carney's decision to strike a deal with China, controversial as it might be in Washington, makes perfect sense when you understand the position he's in. He's leading a country of 40 million people, situated next to a country of 330 million that's becoming increasingly erratic in its trade policy. He can't just hope Trump changes his mind. He can't just wait for American politics to stabilize. He has farmers who need markets today, workers who need jobs today, communities that need economic activity today. So he went to Beijing. He made a deal. And now the entire North American trade system has to recalibrate around that new reality. The question that keeps me awake at night, the question that should be keeping every supply chain manager and every trade policy expert awake, is whether this is reversible. Can these relationships be repaired after the damage Trump has inflicted? Can Canada be convinced to prioritize the American market again if a future administration adopts a different approach? Can the supply chains being reconfigured right now be reconfigured again in a few years if political winds shift? I don't know. Nobody knows. What I do know is that trust, once broken, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. And Trump has been systematically breaking trust for years now, with Canada, with Mexico, with Europe, with Asian allies. Every time he imposes tariffs without warning, every time he threatens to abandon agreements, every time he treats trade as a weapon rather than a tool for mutual prosperity, he's telling America's partners they can't count on us. And so they're finding new partners. Carney found China. Europe is finding South America. The world is reorganizing itself around the assumption that America can't be relied upon. And when the supply chains finish reconfiguring, when the new trade relationships are fully established, when the infrastructure gets built to support these alternative networks, we're going to wake up one day and realize that American economic dominance, the thing we've taken for granted for 75 years, has quietly slipped away. That's the real story behind Carney's China deal. It's not about electric vehicles or canola tariffs or any single commodity. It's about the slow-motion collapse of the economic order that made American prosperity possible. And Trump, with his tariffs and his threats and his complete inability to see beyond the next news cycle, is accelerating that collapse every single day. The supply chains aren't paralyzed yet, but they're seizing up. Every company that delays an investment decision because they don't know what the trade rules will look like next year, that's paralysis. Every farmer who can't commit to planting decisions because they don't know if they'll have market access, that's paralysis. Every manufacturer who's building excess inventory as insurance against supply disruptions, that's paralysis. It's happening right now, all around us, and most people won't notice until it's too late to stop it. So when you see headlines about Trump and Carney and trade deals with China, understand what you're really looking at. You're watching the architecture of global commerce being redrawn. You're seeing supply chains that took generations to build being dismantled in months. You're witnessing the moment when America's closest allies decided they needed backup plans because Washington had become too unreliable. And that wheat, that canola, those agricultural exports that connect Canadian fields to American tables, they're just one visible thread in a system that's coming apart. Pull that thread and you start to see all the others. Pull those and the whole thing unravels. The paralysis is real. The consequences are coming. And 6 months from now, when the USMCA review begins, we're going to discover whether the damage can be contained or whether we're past the point of no return. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening behind the headlines, what's genuinely at stake in these trade negotiations, hit that like button and subscribe to Hems Reports because this story is far from over. I'll be tracking every development as we head toward that July review. Drop a comment below. Do you think Trump's trade strategy is strengthening America or pushing our allies away? I'm genuinely curious what you think, because this moment, right now, might be the inflection point where everything changes.